It's now time for On the Line with Cheryl Wilkerson. The conversation will range from local dialogue to international. This show is meant to enlighten, inform, and to inspire. On the Line with Cheryl Wilkerson begins now.
Hello and happy Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day. Happy Mother of the Graduates Day as well. I know a lot of colleges are graduating those seniors today, so it is a joyous day indeed. My name is Cheryl Wilkerson. This is On the Line with Cheryl Wilkerson. I have a tale for you all today. Many of you may not have ever heard of this, but after the next 30 minutes, you are going to be well informed. We welcome to On the Line Kristen Green. She is a New York Times best-selling author, and she is the reason why I want you all to know this story, because I heard her doing an interview, and I was almost wrecking the car learning the history that I did not know. So welcome to On the Line, Kristen Green. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Cheryl.
Well, I am so glad that you are here. You, like I said, you are a New York Times best-selling author. You've written a book called Something Must Be Done about Prince Edward County. But your latest book is called The Devil's Half Acre. So I have the book in my hand. Went and bought it this week. I haven't finished reading it, but I was bound and determined to have this interview with you because I think that it will inspire. And it's always good to know the history. So first and foremost, who is Kristen Green?
Well, I'm a mom and a wife and a longtime journalist. I'm a native of Farmville, Virginia, which is the county seat for Prince Edward County, Virginia. And I'm a really curious person who is determined to make the South a better place.
And so you decided to do that through journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think journalism just became a natural path for me. I went to college at Mary Washington College, now known as the University of Mary Washington. And the first semester, I took a journalism class, and I was just hooked. I think it was sort of a strange match for me because I grew up, like I said, in a small town in Farmville. I attended a small private school that I later learned was Segregation Academy, one of the school started in the aftermath of Brown v. Board of Education. And I didn't even really know the story of my own hometown growing up. The story was that Prince Edward County closed its public schools rather than desegregate, and they stayed closed for 5 years. And the school that I attended and that my parents attended and that my grandfather helped found, Prince Edward Academy, now known as Fuqua School, was founded when the county closed its schools. But instead of just starting a school for white children, a private school, county leaders also defunded public education and changed the face of Black families' lives forever and changed the county forever, too.
Why do you think that they did that? What was the message in, we're not just going to take our children and have them learn elsewhere, our white children, we're going to close the schools altogether so Black children can't learn. What was the message behind that?
Well, realizing that, coming to that realization while I was doing the research, that they could have just opened a private school and not closed the public schools. I think it was an act of intentional evil. It's an act of white supremacy. It's intended to punish Black families and to keep Black children from learning and from achieving. And they were right. It changed the trajectory of many people's lives. But it was realizing that action that they took was so intentional. It really changed how I did my job as a journalist and how I thought about storytelling, because, the narrative really had never, the traditional narrative had never really spelled that out, that this wasn't an act that they had to, even if they felt strongly that they didn't want their children to go to school with Black children, these white leaders didn't have to close the public schools. Really, they were the only community in the nation that did this. So it was a punishment for Black families for Barbara John's walkout at our Moton High School in 1951, and it was a punishment for Black families signing on to lawsuits that the NAACP filed on their behalf, which became one of the 5 cases under the umbrella of Brown v. Board of Education. I guess white leaders felt embarrassed by this attention on them, and they decided that Black children would pay the price.
They would pay the price. So we fast forward now to this book that you've read, The Devil's Half Acre. Underneath that, it says the untold story of how one woman liberated the South's most notorious slave jail. What was the name of that woman?
Mary Lumpkin.
Where did Mary Lumpkin come from? Give us her background.
We know so little about her, but we know that she was born enslaved in Virginia in 1832. And by 1845, she was living in a slave jail in Richmond, Virginia, in the Chaco Bottom, below the state capitol and the governor's mansion. And it was known as Lumpkin's jail. And she was enslaved by the slave trader that owned it, Robert Lumpkin, and had her first of 5 children with him in that year in 1845. She may have become his possession earlier. He may have owned her as early as 1840, when records show he had a child in his possession, and she was 8 years old. But we know that by 1845, she was living in Lumpkin's jail compound and had a child with Robert Lumpkin.
Did he ever have children of his own? Do we know? Was he married?
He was not married. No, he was not married. I believe that he had children, or likely had children with other enslaved women. But he had a kind of relationship that doesn't infer consent. So he had some kind of relationship. He chose Mary Lumpkin as his children and to live with him on his compound, as other slave traders in Chaco Bottom did with enslaved women. And he provided for those children and cared for those children. But those children were enslaved, and Mary Lumpkin was enslaved. I've talked to her descendants, and one of her descendants told me the story she heard growing up from a very young age was that Mary Lumpkin, had agency in that relationship. She told Robert Lumpkin, look, you can do what you want with me, but, quote, these children have to be free. And I think that's such an inspiring story here on Mother's Day, to think about a very young woman, an enslaved woman, who knew what she wanted for herself and for her children. And she used the little agency that she had in that relationship with Robert Lumpkin to get her children educated, to get them free well before the Civil War, and to also secure them an inheritance.
That is remarkable, because whatever I've ever heard about Robert Lumpkin, the jail is always described as notorious or horrific, or those are the kinds of words I always heard associated with Lumpkin's jail. So I don't think he was a very kind man. How did this enslaved woman have the gumption to stand up to him?
I don't know. I don't give Robert Lumpkin very much credit. I mean, he certainly was all those things that you said. I mean, let me describe what a slave jail is. It didn't mean that enslaved people had committed some crime, right? They weren't being held there because they had done something criminal. They just had the bad luck of being sold, right? And so he had created this business that, served a need for white enslavers who either wanted to sell the people they enslaved or wanted to buy more. I mean, it was really like a holding cell, a holding pen for those enslaved people. But he was particularly brutal. He was known as a bully trader, and he would torture or punish enslaved people for a fee. So people who lived locally could send their slaves there to be brutally punished. And he provided many of the services that visiting enslavers would need in his jail. He had a hotel for enslaved people, for enslavers, for slave traders that were visiting. And he had a restaurant and bar where they could eat and they could have a drink. His own home was also in this compound, and he would take in horses and put them up for the night. So he was really providing many of the services that visiting enslavers would need during their stay. And so he profited off of this terrible domestic slavery, as all of Richmond did. So he was not, I don't think of him as a kind man, but like many people, he is complex, and he cared for his own children.
That's just sick to me. That is just absolutely sick. This Lumpkin's slave jail that if you're in Richmond any period of time, you will hear about, is it still standing today? What is the condition of it, if it is, or what has happened to it? Tell us that story.
No, it was taken down in the 1890s, and with it, this history was essentially erased. But I came upon this story and decided to pursue a book because I learned about it through an archaeological dig that was done in, let's see, what year was that? 2008. Historians in Richmond and people who were involved with the Slave Trail Commission here learned of its existence and wanted to see if they could first figure out where it had been and then see if there were any archaeological remnants of the jail. And so they undertook this month-long archaeological dig, and it was described to me by archaeologists as like a once-in-a-lifetime experience of like they dug up some 15 feet of fill dirt and did actually find the remnants of this property. So half of it is under Interstate 95, and the other half is sort of on the very edge of Interstate 95, kind of behind the Main Street train station in Richmond. But I wasn't in town. I didn't live here yet when they were doing that dig. But people said you could stand on the edge and look down into it and like imagine what it had been like when Mary Lumpkin walked across that yard in Lumpkin slave jail property. And so I think with that archaeological dig, some people did, start to learn more about Lumpkin jail and therefore Mary Lumpkin. But I read a piece written by the Smithsonian magazine that mentioned her. And once I heard about her, I couldn't forget her. Like I hadn't written the Something Must Be Done About Prince Edward County book yet. I was just working as a reporter at the local paper with the dreams of writing that book when I heard about Mary Lumpkin. But when I finished the Prince Edward County book, I was still thinking about her. I just felt that her story was so important and needed to be told, and that so many white people had intentionally erased her story and the story of so many other of the 2 million women and girls that were enslaved in the American South. And I just wanted to play a role in telling this really amazing story.
What has been the reaction from white people to you writing these type of stories? Even your book, Something Must Be Done About Prince Edward County, and now this, do other white people look at you and say, why are you stirring up this trouble?
I mean, I definitely said that about the Prince Edward book because I think there's this idea of loyalty,
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of, people feel that you're supposed to be, quote unquote, loyal to your family. And I think that loyalty means like keeping secrets. But I didn't feel that at all. I felt that it was, freeing to look back and analyze what my grandfather had done. And to say, yes, like he was my grandfather and I loved him, but he also did something that I consider morally wrong. But there were definitely people in my town that were like, this is a scab that hasn't been allowed to heal. Like, why are you coming in here?
Mm-hmm.
Like stuff is just under the rug. And I felt like white people really didn't want it to be brought up again. Whether that's about shame or whether it's about guilt or just not wanting to, face this history. But I feel like the Prince Edward story and the story of Mary Lumpkin, this is, all of our history. Like, this isn't Black history. This isn't white history. This is like our whole country's history. And I guess I just got really passionate about telling these, sort of hidden stories, or hidden to white people anyway, stories after I read the Prince Edward story. And I just, for me, as a curious person, it's so interesting to like start with Mary Lumpkin and then to put her in context, to put her in the context of this jail and put this jail in the context of all the slave jails in Shockoe Bottom and this whole slave district. And then to put the slave district in the context of the domestic slave trade, where Richmond was the second largest hub in this slave trade that very few people can, I feel, differentiate from the transatlantic slave trade, which ended in 1808. And this domestic slave trade that was already bubbling under the surface, was already in existence, became a really powerful force and resulted in very many children being separated from their parents and husbands from their wives. And it really differs from the story that we were told growing up that Virginia slaveholders were benevolent and kind. And they didn't want to separate families. I mean, we weren't told the truth.
You weren't told the truth. You're right. And so were there Black people, when they see this white woman come in asking them questions, were they hesitant to tell the oral histories that they knew from their family? Or were they pleased that you were asking the question? And I ask that because I have an aunt, and I remember speaking with her, and anytime we talked about hard times for Black people, she never wanted to talk about it. Never, never, never. So I'm curious as to what was the response that you got from Black people.
Well, in Prince Edward, it was really a mixed bag. And I think I went into it thinking that as a reporter, I could like get anyone to tell their stories. But I realized that wasn't true. Like there were plenty of people who were like really excited to tell their stories and honored that I asked. And I had multiple instances of siblings telling me that they had never all sat down together and talked about what happened to them when the schools closed. So there were definitely people who didn't want to share. There were people who I felt like shared but had kind of practiced how they told the story, like weren't really willing to go very deep. Mm-hmm. And then there were the people who were like willing to just like talk to me anytime, all the time, and like couldn't get enough of telling their stories. So, you know, it's tough when you hear like read in the media about the Black response to something. I mean, it's the same. There's no white response either, right? It's like it's layered. Individuals have different responses to like how they want to tell the stories. But, you know, there were definitely people in Farmville who felt like, you know, it would have been nice to have a Black person tell the story. It would have been a different story. And I think Black people still can tell their stories. You know, some have written their own perspectives. But for me, it was like a chance to explain, kind of think through my childhood, you know, how little I was taught and how little I knew about the history and kind of how I became, you know, a knowledgeable person and became a journalist. And then also to trace like my family's role in this and white's role in closing the schools, while also telling the story of how it impacted Black people. As far as this current book, The Devil's Half Acre, there were very few people I could find that were connected to her. In fact, I spent a lot of time doing genealogy, and like most of her descendants that I found, mm-hmm. I found her descendants, her oldest daughter, and they had all lived as white for generations. They didn't know anything about her, and they didn't know anything about Robert Lumpkin.
Wow.
They were living on the West Coast.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, it's crazy. But I did find one descendant who lives in D.C., and she is a professor at Howard, Tara Olivia Haran. She is really excited to collaborate with me on this and share the story, and for me to help her connect some dots, you know, some stories she heard orally to match them up with the things I learned in my research. So that's been a really fun connection for both of us. I mean, I think it's been difficult for her in some ways too, but it's also answered a lot of questions that she's had all of her life. I don't want to speak for her, but I think I think the experience has meant a lot to her too.
We, of course, are broadcasting from the campus of Norfolk State University. We were established in 1935, but could you please explain to the listening audience about Mary Lumpkin and the important role that she played in the birth of Virginia Union University? I marvel at these HBCUs. 1865, I think, for Virginia Union. Just think about the condition and where Black people were when these universities were founded. So 1865, you think about the Civil War, you think about the beginning of the Ku Klux Klan. 1935, you think about, you know, the Great Depression had just come through or whatever. And these people got together and they made sure that for generations, people would be educated, Black children would be educated. And it gives me goosebumps of pride. Tell us the connection between Mary Lumpkin and Virginia Union University.
Sure. Well, just briefly, let me share that she was able to move her children to safety prior to the Civil War. She moved her daughters with Robert Lumpkin's help to Massachusetts, a free state, where they attended Ipswich Female Seminary, a little coastal town, in 1856. And while they were in Ipswich, Mary Lumpkin traveled to Philadelphia and purchased a home in her own name. Well, actually enslaved in Virginia. She bought a home in Philadelphia, which was, of course, in a free state as well. And she moved her 4 eldest children there when the girls finished 2 years at the seminary. And so they were safely ensconced in Philadelphia prior to the Civil War, and where Mary Lumpkin joined them with her youngest child in 1860. So I believe that they lived there for the duration of the Civil War while Robert Lumpkin continued to operate the slave jail in Richmond. When the Civil War ended, Mary Lumpkin returned to Richmond. We don't know why. Perhaps she had some kind of agreement with Robert Lumpkin, but she returned to him. She returned to Richmond. She returned to Virginia. And he was running some sort of hotel out of the former slave jail. He died a year later in 1866, and the following year, in 1867, Mary Lumpkin had an encounter with Nathaniel Culver, a minister from the American Baptist Home Mission Society. And he had been desperately seeking a place a permanent location, or a more permanent location for his school, which was called the Richmond Theological School for Freedmen, which had in fact been operating in rooms around the city since 1865, since a few weeks after the Civil War ended. And this meeting, whether it was a chance meeting or whether Mary Lumpkin's pastor had set up this meeting with Nathaniel Culver, resulted in her renting the slave jail to him and to the Mission Society for 3 years at $1,000 a year. And soon after, he opened up the school there on the grounds of this former slave jail, turning what enslaved people had called the Devil's Half Acre into what became God's Half Acre, a place where Black men had been imprisoned and tortured, to a place they could be educated.
That is remarkable. That is absolutely remarkable. And Virginia Union, it is one of the oldest historically Black colleges and universities in America today.
That's correct.
It is just. So does Virginia Union acknowledge Mary Lumpkin? Do they know that story? Do they acknowledge her?
Yes, they do acknowledge her. I think, her story hasn't been very prominent, but in the last few years, I think she's been, the recognition of her has increased. They named a road through campus for her, Mary Lumpkin Drive, and where previously the markers on campus didn't mention her, they installed a marker that acknowledged her as the mother of Virginia Union University. And I'm hopeful that the recognition of her will just continue. Perhaps there'll be a Mary Lumpkin Day that they have annually on campus, or perhaps, they'll create some kind of bigger monument to her. And my hope is that they'll do more supposedly they teach the freshmen about her coming in, but hopefully they'll adopt my book or some other book that tells the story of Mary Lumpkin, so that students who come through can really take a lot of pride in the story, because she was one of few formerly enslaved women, Black women, involved in founding HBCUs. And so her story is really kind of special in that way.
It really was. And Richmond is just, it's complicated. The history there is complicated. The home of the Confederacy, And I never, ever, ever thought I would see the day when those Confederate statues would come down Kristen Green. I never thought I would see that. And to see that happen, and to see people at those statues until they came down, including white people who were bound and determined not to leave until those statues came down. I'm like, what? This in the land of the Confederacy? What would Mary Lumpkin think?
I know, it's great. I hope that, I think it was really remarkable that we were able to get them down. It should have happened much earlier, in my opinion, and they really never should have gone up, since they told a false history. But I'm hopeful that Richmond can become known for telling our true history, our unvarnished history. I think it would be amazing if we could follow through with this proposal that's in the works to create a slavery museum down at the very site where Lumpkin's chair was. They have covered up the archaeological dig in order to protect the site. But if a museum could be built there, and if a memorial could be built around it, and we could really create what they're now calling a heritage campus to remember and to memorialize, but also to teach about the slave trade out of Richmond and the many ways that Black men, women, and children were harmed during the slave trade, and the way that Richmond and Virginia benefited from the slave trade. I think it would go a long way in acknowledging that this is all of our history, and it's something that, we all need to be deeply informed about, to move on, to get past shame and be just more aware of our role, in this history, and help it happen again.
I am always amazed when I talk to a white person and they're like you, they sound so hopeful or whatever. And I don't know if that's always shared by Black people because of the experiences, you know what I mean? But it is good to hear the hope that you put out there, because that's, of course, what we want. It's just because of the history and the experiences, we're so skeptical, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, books like this can inform white people about their roles. And instead of feeling ashamed or guilty, go out and do something. Raise money for this museum. Fight to have it created. Fight for this space to be preserved and to be memorialized and to become a place of teaching history, and make sure that your government doesn't ban these histories, doesn't ban books that we can use as teaching tools, and make sure that your children and their schools are teaching this real history. I mean, that's the way that we can make up for some of the harm we've caused.
We only have about 3 minutes left. 2 questions for you. The first being, do you think your book would ever be banned because it teaches the true history? And like you said, when black people are talking about this, they don't want guilt from white people. They want white people to recognize that you are benefiting from the very systems that these enslavers put in place. So like you said, we want you to go out and do something to dismantle them. And I think that's often lost. They get stuck on the guilt. And no, we know you didn't enslave anybody, but you are benefiting to this day by systems that were put in place then. So go do something.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I feel. No, I wouldn't say that this book would be banned or not be banned. I mean, anything is possible in our current environment, and people say, oh, read banned books. But no. Banned book, like if you ban a book, you're ruining that author's opportunity to tell these stories. And so we should be doing everything we can to fight the banning of books and to promote the telling of our true histories to our children, to our college students, to everyone. So yeah, I think the best thing that white people can do is become as educated as they possibly can about this, about our history, about the things we've done. Our oppression, and that's a good start into, like you said, dismantling systemic racism here.
Well, I just want to know, before we run out of time, what is the next book? That's what I want to know.
This book really made me more of a feminist, so I think I would like to write about women, but I might do something like more modern day and not be stuck in the archives for 7 years this time.
Not be stuck. Kristen Green has been my guest today for On the Line. She is a New York Times bestselling author. So this book that I have in my hand, it's called The Devil's Half Acre. I'm going to curl up with it this weekend and get all the details that we didn't have time to get in today. Also, you might want to pick up her book, Something Must Be Done About Prince Edward County. She has done a lot of history. It's taken a lot of time out of her life. She has sacrificed time from her family, but she is on a mission to tell the truth. And I so respect that so very much. Thank you so much for being on the line today.
Thank you, Cheryl. I really enjoyed it.
We had a wonderful time. Look, it is still Mother's Day. You all go out today. Enjoy this wonderful day. To all the graduates, we are so super proud of you. To all the parents in the village that made sure those graduates graduated, we honor you as well, because we know it's not easy. We know you did not do it alone. I'm Cheryl Wilkerson. I am thankful for this 30 minutes that you give me every Sunday. I'm truly thankful for that. And we will talk again soon. Again, don't forget, The Devil's Half Acre, the untold story of how one woman liberated the South's most notorious slave jail and her connection to Virginia Union University. You all take care. We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.